Imagine discovering that the person whose job it is to put criminals behind bars is actually trying to empty the prisons. And what happens to the crime rate when they do?
It's a really jarring thought, isn't it?
It is. Welcome to the deep dive, everyone. We are so glad you're here. If you've been watching the news over the last few weeks, you've probably seen this string of really shocking headlines.
Yeah, the ones where accused killers are simply walking free.
Exactly. I mean, out in Los Angeles, there was this case where a USC student fatally stabs a homeless man on Greek Row, but the district attorney just refuses to file charges.
Right, and down in San Diego, there was a suspect arrested for a brutal string of killings at homeless camps, and he's suddenly released from jail.
Over in Lawrence, Kansas, a first-degree murder charge in a tent camp stabbing gets dropped right before trial. And then there's the absolute outrage in Philadelphia over the horrific kidnapping and murder of a 23-year-old woman named Ketta Scott.
Which was committed by a man who had just been released because his prior violent charges were dropped.
Right. It's incredibly heavy stuff. But these headlines aren't just isolated local news stories, are they?
No, not at all. They all connect directly to this massive, fiery debate sweeping the nation right now. We're talking about the rise of the progressive prosecutor.
So our mission for you today is to cut right through the extreme political noise on this, because it gets loud.
Very loud.
We're taking a look at a thick stack of sources. We've got a massive 21-year academic study, real-world case files, new legal theories. We want to find out what really happens when local district attorneys prioritize reform over traditional punishment.
And to start, we really need to define what a progressive prosecutor actually is. Keeping it simple, these are elected officials who run on platforms to end cash bail, reduce mass incarceration, and target inequities in the justice system.
Which sounds great on a campaign poster.
Right. But what the sources show is how those platforms actually collide with the daily realities of police work.
Because the police are out on the streets making arrests, and the prosecutors are back at the office deciding not to press charges, that creates a huge amount of friction, doesn't it?
It creates a severe and immediate feedback loop. Normally, police and prosecutors have this very tight, symbiotic working relationship. But the data shows exactly how this new de-prosecution strategy impacts street cops.
How so?
Well, when police officers know that certain crimes simply will not be prosecuted by the local DA, they get deeply demoralized. The data shows they actually stop making arrests for those specific crimes.
Because what's the point?
Exactly. They figure, why risk the physical confrontation and why spend hours on paperwork if the suspect is just going to be released before the ink is dry?
And that reduces the fear of getting caught among offenders.
Which, in turn, impacts overall crime reporting and arrest rates. It just spirals.
And the sources show some extreme reactions to this breakdown in trust. It isn't just, cops grumbling in the break room.
Oh, no, it gets much more intense than that.
Cops are actively bypassing their local district attorneys entirely. If they know the local DA won't take the case, they take their arrests straight to federal prosecutors to make sure the suspect actually faces charges.
Which is a massive breach of standard protocol.
Right. And in some cities, this friction turns into outright public hostility. You can look at St. Louis as a prime example.
St. Louis was wild.
Former Circuit Attorney Kimberly Gardner pushed a strict de-prosecution agenda and ended up alienating her entire police force by publicly labeling them as racists. The working relationship didn't just strain, it completely broke down.
Which brings us to a really crucial distinction that we have to make here.
What's that?
We see these headlines about dropped murder charges and immediately think it is all just political ideology at play. But it isn't always politics.
That's a really good point.
Often dropping a case is a strict ethical requirement. The law requires prosecutors to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt.
The highest standard in the legal system.
Right. So if the evidence is weak, if it's missing, or if it points heavily to self-defense, prosecutors cannot legally or ethically proceed. It simply doesn't matter who is sitting in the DA's chair.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because let's use the cases we mentioned at the start to illustrate this. This is where the theory actually hits the street. Take the USC student in Los Angeles.
Okay, let's look at that one.
DA George Gascón did not charge him, and the public was absolutely furious. The media framed it as another soft-on-crime prosecutor letting a killer walk.
But when you look at the actual case files, the story changes entirely.
Completely. There was a 911 call and clear statements from two other students proving the suspect genuinely feared the victim had a gun and was going to use it. Under the law, It was a clear-cut case of self-defense.
Exactly. A traditional tough-on-crime prosecutor would have had to drop that exact same case.
It's an ethical obligation.
And then you have cases involving the simple exhaustion of evidence.
Like the San Diego case.
Right. In San Diego, police arrested Anthony Padgett for setting homeless men on fire. He strongly resembled the guy in the surveillance video, and, incredibly, he even had a 2010 conviction for doing the exact same thing.
Which sounds like a slam dunk.
It does. But a physical resemblance and a past record are not enough to prove murder in a court of law today. The physical evidence tying him to these specific new crimes was simply too weak.
You see the exact same pattern in the Lawrence, Kansas case. Julius Beasley was charged with murdering his friend Crystal White in a homeless camp. Investigators even found partial DNA on a latex glove at the scene.
Again, on television, that's case closed.
Right, cue the credits. But in reality, witnesses were disappearing into the transient community, testimony was heavily conflicting, and the forensic evidence just wasn't strong enough to secure a conviction.
So the prosecutor had to drop the charges ethically.
Though they did make sure to leave the door open to refile later if new evidence surfaced.
But we have to look at the other side of the coin, too, because the system doesn't always work perfectly. While some cases are dropped for valid ethical reasons, others are dropped due to systemic failures and aggressive ideological policies.
And those failures can lead to absolute tragedy.
Right. It makes sense in theory to drop low-level cases, but try telling that to the family of Kata Scott.
From their perspective, it looks like the system completely failed to protect them. Let's dig into what happened in Philadelphia.
She was kidnapped and murdered by a 21-year-old man named Keon King.
And here's the deeply tragic part of this story. King had just been arrested earlier in the year for kidnapping and strangling a previous girlfriend. He was a known, violent threat.
But when witnesses didn't show up to court for that initial case, the DA's office dropped the charges and King walked free. Soon after, he murdered Kata Scott.
Critics point the finger directly at Philadelphia DA Larry Krasner for this outcome.
They do. They highlight what a former judge calls a bail gimmick that his office uses.
A bail gimmick?
Yeah. Krasner strongly opposes cash bail, arguing that it criminalizes poverty. So, to protest the system, his office routinely requests a massive automatic bail amount of $999,999 for defendants.
Instead of evaluating cases individually and requesting a tailored amount.
Exactly.
Wait, I need to stop you there. Because why would $1 million bail lead to someone walking free?
Yeah.
Shouldn't a massive bail request keep a dangerous suspect in jail?
You would think so, but you have to look at the mechanics of how bail actually works.
Okay, walk me through it.
Magistrates are legally obligated to set bail based on two specific factors: the defendant's flight risk and the severity of the crime. They are not allowed to set bail based on a political protest.
Okay.
So when they see a blanket $1 million request come across their desk for almost every single case, they view the request as legally invalid.
Because it's clearly a stunt.
Right. Because they can't take the DA's request seriously, the magistrates default to their own standard, often much lower, bail schedules. As a result, dangerous suspects like Keon King end up securing a low bail, walking free, and committing more violence.
And it isn't just Philly experiencing this. In Fairfax, Virginia, DA Steve Descano recently dropped murder charges against a suspect in a bus stop stabbing.
And that happened right after his office faced immense national backlash for releasing a different suspect who also went on to murder a woman at a bus stop.
When you hear these stories back to back, it sounds like a complete collapse of public safety.
It does. These localized tragedies absolutely drive the public narrative, and they are horrific for the communities involved. But to really understand what is happening nationwide, you have to step back and look at the hard data.
Right. Does reform actually equal more crime overall?
We have a massive 21-year academic study from 2000 to 2020 that looked at the 100 largest U.S. counties.
This is the core data answering your biggest question today.
We are talking about 2 decades of data spanning multiple economic recessions, policing trends, and political cycles.
And I was actually really surprised by the findings in this study. You would expect a massive spike across the board based on the headlines. But the data actually shows a statistically significant 7% increase in property crimes under progressive prosecutors.
Just 7%.
7%.
And we need to provide crucial context for that 7% number because it isn't quite what it sounds like.
What do you mean?
Across the country, overall crime actually fell during this 21-year period. Crime went down almost everywhere.
Right. The national trend was downward.
Exactly. However, property crime fell less in progressive cities compared to cities with traditional prosecutors. That is where that 7% difference comes from.
Oh, so it is a relative increase.
Yes. The crime rate didn't necessarily skyrocket, it just didn't drop as much as it did in tougher jurisdictions.
But still, a 7% relative bump in property crime is devastating for local business owners. That means more smashed windows and more retail theft.
Absolutely, it has real economic impact.
But that's not what is driving the massive public outrage. People are terrified of violent crime. Does the 21-year study actually back up the fear that these policies lead to more murders and assaults?
The short answer is no. Over the full 21 years, the data shows absolutely no long-term statistical increase in violent crime under progressive prosecutors compared to traditional ones.
None at all.
There was a brief, isolated spike in violent crime between 2014 and 2016 in some of these jurisdictions, but long-term, the violent crime rate did not surge the way critics claim it did.
Interesting.
The massive waves of violent crime seem to be driven by larger national trends, not the specific policies of a local DA.
So if we step back and look at the whole picture, we have a 7% relative bump in property crime, but no major long-term spike in violent crime. How do the two sides of this debate explain these numbers?
It fundamentally boils down to two competing sociological theories. The critics rely heavily on deterrence theory.
I can take this one. Deterrence theory is the idea that leniency sends a very clear message to the streets. If criminals know they won't be prosecuted for retail theft or that cash bail is eliminated for certain offenses, they lose the fear of consequences.
It removes the friction of committing a crime.
Exactly. And the critics argue this directly fuels the 7% bump in property crime we see in the data. If you don't punish the small things, people feel emboldened to keep doing them.
Makes perfect logical sense. Proponents of reform, however, counter this with coercive mobility theory.
Coercive mobility theory.
Yes. The core idea there is that mass incarceration is fundamentally destabilizing to a community.
How so?
When you remove a massive percentage of working-age men from a single zip code and put them in prison, you aren't just punishing criminals, you are mathematically guaranteeing a drop in local business revenue and a massive spike in single-parent households.
And the data heavily shows that economic desperation and broken family structures are prime indicators for future crime.
Exactly. So, by locking too many people up, you actually create a cycle of poverty and crime that ruins the community for generations.
Both sides have really strong theoretical arguments. The debate makes sense on paper.
It does.
But in the real world, theory eventually meets the voters. And voters have a breaking point.
They absolutely do.
You can actually track this breaking point geographically right now. Driven by these local crime spikes, whether they are property crimes or high-profile violent tragedies, voters are fighting back hard against the perception that prosecutors are putting their ideology over justice.
We are seeing a massive political pendulum swing. Let's look at the fallout.
It's pretty sweeping. In San Francisco, Chesa Boudin was completely recalled and thrown out of office by the voters.
In Los Angeles, George Gascón was defeated at the ballot box.
In Chicago, Kim Foxx declined to even run for re-election after facing severe backlash from her own party.
In Baltimore, Marilyn Mosby was defeated and later convicted in federal court for perjury.
And in St. Louis, Kimberly Gardner resigned while facing multiple misconduct investigations. It's happening everywhere.
Which raises a massive question for you to consider. If the harsh traditional model leads to the devastation of mass incarceration, and the progressive model leads to a fierce voter revolt and localized tragedies, what is the alternative?
How do we escape this chaotic political pendulum swinging back and forth every election cycle?
The sources highlight a new way forward proposed by Vanderbilt Law School. They call it the caretaker model.
The caretaker model. Let's get into that.
The caretaker concept argues that prosecutors need to stop acting like crusaders. They shouldn't be white knights trying to fix all of society's deeply rooted sociological problems, and they shouldn't be rigid punishers locking everyone up to look tough on crime either.
They should simply be caretakers of the justice system.
Exactly. Their job is to serve the law and ensure the machinery of the system functions fairly and efficiently.
I want to make sure we give a concrete example of this because it sounds great in theory, but how does a caretaker actually handle a congested court docket differently than a progressive or traditional DA?
Okay, imagine a prosecutor is looking at a massive pile of case files for the week. They have 50 low-level shoplifting and trespassing cases, and they have 3
Imagine
complex
finding out your
armed
electric
robbery
bill
cases.
is secretly funding the government's
Right.
massive
A
spending
traditional
addiction.
prosecutor
It is
might
a
try to
pretty
prosecute
shocking
all
realization when you
53,
actually look at the
stretching their
math.
staff
Right.
incredibly
Well,
thin
imagine for a
and
second that
likely
you have a
watching the
savings
major
account.
cases.
While a progressive
And,
prosecutor might throw out the 50
you swore to
shoplifting
your
cases
family,
as a
hand over
political
heart,
statement against criminalizing
this
poverty.
money was
Right.
strictly
But
for
the
fixing a
caretaker does
leaking
something
roof.
different.
What do they do? said,
The caretaker
don't
still
fix this roof,
dismisses or diverts
house
those
is gonna
50
collapse.
low-level
It's an
cases,
existential crisis
defaulting
for
to
the house.
leniency.
Exactly. It's the Save
But
the
they
House
don't
fund.
do it to make a
But
grand
then,
political
your car
point
breaks
or
down,
to protest the
you spend a
system.
little too much
They
on
do it
groceries,
simply
you
because
got
the
bills
system is
piling
too
up.
congested.
So what do?
Yes.
You
The
raid
courts
the
are
roof fund.
overworked, the public
take that money,
defenders are
pay off your
overloaded,
credit cards,
and
and
there's
tell your
only
family,
so
hey,
much
don't worry,
time
we'll
in the
fix
day.
the roof
So a
later.
caretaker
Right.
realizes,
And in this
that
scenario,
you have to clear
the
out
roof
the
is the
low-level
planet,
cases,
or at least
just so the
Maryland's
system
climate
has the
goals.
actual
And the
resources,
car is a
manpower, and
massive
courtroom time
self-inflicted
to successfully prosecute those 3 dangerous armed robbers.
It is a highly
completely
practical
avoidable
solution, not an
deficit, I might add.
ideological one.
Welcome to the deep
So when you
dive.
look at all of this, the big
Today we're
takeaway for me
exploring a
here
classic
is that the
case of
justice
fiscal
system
sleight
is an
of hand
incredibly
coming out of
fragile
Annapolis.
ecosystem.
We are looking
Very
at the
much so.
strategic energy
When you pull
investment
one
fund,
lever, like the safe,
aggressively trying to end
it's a
mass
huge
incarceration,
pot of money meant
it
to
impacts
save the
everything
environment.
else.
But
It
it's
impacts
turning into
police
a hidden
morale, it
tax
impacts public
on every
safety,
single person,
and it impacts the
paying an
everyday
electric
lives of
bill in
citizens who
Maryland.
just want to feel
It
safe in
really
their
is. It's
neighborhoods
become
and
the
run their
center of a
businesses
huge
without fear
political
of
fight.
theft.
And
You've
the hard
got a
data backs
Democratic
that up.
governor,
It does.
frustrated
Electing a
environmentalists
progressive
making some
prosecutor
very
does
awkward
lead to a bump
compromises,
in property
and
crime,
conservative critics
even if
who are
the
rightly
dramatic
calling
violent
this whole
crime
thing a
spikes we
shell
hear about
game.
are usually localized
And when you look
failures
at the
rather than a
documents we have
nationwide
today,
rule.
But
Reports,
as we saw with the
budget
heartbreaking
proposals,
cases in
critiques
Philadelphia
from
and
Senate
Virginia,
Republicans,
those
it is
specific
really hard
failures
to
have
unsee it.
Our
absolute
mission for this deep
severe
dive is simple.
consequences. Follow
It's
the
a
money.
delicate balance.
Always follow the
We
money.
want a
We are
fair
going to
system
see
that doesn't
how a
lock
fund
people up
designed to
needlessly
fight
and destroy
climate change
communities.
is being used
But we
to
also
plug
want a
holes in
system
the
that
state
protects
budget.
the innocent.
And we'll dig into
from
the argument
violent,
that this isn't
repeat
found money at
offenders.
all.
And I want
This
to
is
leave you
essentially
with
a
a
backdoor
final
tax on
provocative
families.
thought to mull
Let's get
over.
right into
Let's
it.
hear it.
The
We spend
Strategic
all of our
Energy
time
Investment
arguing
Fund
about the
sounds
local
very
prosecutor.
official,
We
very
recall
important.
them, we
What does it
elect
actually
new
do?
ones, we
Well,
obsess over their
on
daily
paper,
policies.
it is the state's
But in terms
green
of raw
piggy bank.
power in the criminal
This IIF
justice
is managed
system,
by the Maryland
prosecutors
Energy
actually rank
Administration. Its
below
whole
the
stated
police who make
purpose
the
is to
arrests,
reduce energy
below the
bills,
judges who
cut
set the
waste,
sentences,
and fund
far
renewable
below the
energy.
state legislature
Like solar
that
panels
actually
and
writes the
efficiency
laws.
upgrades.
That's a great
Exactly.
point.
So are
But
we
here is
putting
the real aha
entirely
moment
too
of
much
the story.
blame or entirely too much
Where does
hope
the
on
money
the shoulders
actually
of one
come
elected
from?
official to
because
fix
they
our
aren't just
deepest
taxing
societal
you directly
problems?
for it.